read his baby son Yeats. I thought, what a great dad. So that's how I got started. Also one thing, my first writing that's not been immortalized, but I remember it. It's from first grade, and my teacher asked us to describe ourselves. Mm-hmm. And everybody described how tall they were and where they lived and what their hair color was. And I described myself as rectangular and wooden with a hole in the top where you put in ink. So I described myself as a wooden desk, an old-fashioned wooden desk. And my teacher was so happy with this, right? I think she really sort of launched my career as a writer, because she said, oh, this is really creative. This is wonderful. You should all do more like this. And everybody's like, I'm wooden and have a hole in my head for ink? What? So that's how I got started.
Wonderful. Thank you. And maybe your mom's dislike of poetry had something to do with her reading Plato as part of her great books curriculum.
Could be.
So how did you, from then and writing, get into kind of translating? How did and why did that happen?
So when I was at the University of Michigan, I was very close with and soon engaged to be married to a Czech physicist, and through him I met Ladislav Matejka. Ladislav was a professor of Czech at the University of Michigan, and when he found out that I wrote poetry, he insisted that I should translate a poet named Jiří Orten. And I am so grateful to him. Jiří Orten was a friend of Ladislav's in the pre-war days. He was a Czech Jew who was killed at age 22 in the Holocaust. And he's one of the world's greatest poets. He's right up there with whoever you put up there, Rilke, Shakespeare, whatever. And the fact that he achieved such poetry at the age of 22 is just amazing. Now, I really want to recommend, there's a book, it used to be available on Amazon, called White Picture. If you can't find it there, write to me and I'd be happy to send you a copy. It's amazing poetry. Unfortunately, there's another translation out there of Jiří Orten by a man a Czech who loves poetry, and he loved Jiří Orten, but his English is not his native speech. Mm-hmm. So it's a very bad, in my opinion, a very bad translation, and it turns people off. So please don't read that. But anyway, I started translating Jiří Orten with a Czech native speaker named Eva Eckart. And we developed there the process that I used ever after, where I was learning the language, and she was sounding it out to me, I was sounding it out to her. And then she would write a bitskardi, a word for word, and it comes out kind of nonsense at the beginning. And then she'd reorganize it and come up with a sensible, prosaic, just getting the words in and the sense of it. And then I would translate it into a poem. And if we get a chance later at the end, I'd like to read just a little bit. He has one of the great snow poems in history, and I think it goes with Galaktian and Barbakadze. We could do a whole volume of snow poems. Here's just a line. He has a repeated refrain. Somebody stood, it's about a poet, about a painter standing out in the snow in the winter. And it says, somebody stood, palette in hand, in the snow. Snow was falling on the artist's model. He paid no attention. He painted. And I love this image of a man out in the winter with his white palette in the white snow, and he's trying to paint winter with presumably a lot of white, unless he's Galaction and he's using violet. But anyway, so he's having white, and then as he's painting this picture of winter is actually snowing on his canvas. So it's a wonderful poem. So that's how I got started with Orten and Matejka at the University of Michigan.
Great. And how about how did you discover Georgian poetry? Was there anything that inspired you about it to dedicate so much of your time and expertise to it?
Well, I was on the board of the World Association of Poets, and I got talking to the head of the Hungarian section, and he commissioned me eventually to write a small book about my experience with Joseph Brodsky. I was Joseph Brodsky's teaching assistant for 2 years at the university. And of course, Brodsky is a fascinating topic all on his own and with wonderful poetry. I was really captivated by the man and the work. So when a Georgian scholar named Gia Jokhadzev, whose specialty was Brodsky, found out that I had written this autobiographical memoir called Joseph Brodsky Was Joseph Brodsky, he asked me to tell him about my experience with Brodsky, and we started up a correspondence. Eventually, Gia sent me some Georgian poetry. I think the first one was a poem by Ilya Chavchavadze, but I'm not sure. I think it's Spring. Anyway, I translated. He said, "This is the best translation I've ever read. This is great." And so he invited me to come to Georgia and teach at Ilya University. I was an assistant professor, and work with him on a volume of Georgian poetry, which came out from Slavica from Indiana University, and is a good collection. But I said, "So how are we going to begin our translation of Georgian poetry?" He said, "Well, we have to begin with Shota Rustaveli." I said, "Who's that?" I didn't know much. I still don't know much. Anyway, he said he was a 12th century monk. And I said, "Oh God, no, let's not start with him. That's going to be so terribly boring. Who wants to read a 12th century monk?" And he said, "I don't think you'll find him boring." And so he started reading in Georgian, and the sound immediately got to me. It was incredible without knowing a word, just the sound. And then he started telling me the story, this incredible story of these two knights and the two women they loved and the adventures and the tiger and the panther. It was just incredible. And the way Rustaveli would end every chapter like on a cliffhanger. Mm-hmm. And then the first thing I did was to look and see what translations were out there in English. And there wasn't much. And I looked at all the English translations and I didn't like any of them. I especially didn't like Marjorie Wardrope's translation, which was a big, I mean, she's considered a saint. And I think she probably in many ways was. She was very, you know, the history. She was sister to the British ambassador to Georgia, very generous and did a lot of great things. But she translated Rustaveli into flat-footed prose, and it made me cringe. And I was really glad, because if it had been good, then I would have said, well, it's already been done pretty well. But I thought, no, this hasn't been done. So I started doing it. And we did most of the major poets in this anthology. So after becoming acquainted with Rustaveli, I told Gia and a few other people that it was my life's dream to translate The Knight in the Panther Skin. Here's this huge book, and it's all in rhymed verse, A, B, 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 B. It's all 16 syllable lines. It's just, and it's this great thing. It's just great in every way, like Shakespeare is great. The humor, the aphorisms, the story, the rhymes. So I said, it's my life's dream. And so Dato overheard this, and he told his friend Nato, he said, I have this friend Lyn, and she's a wonderful English poet, and she wants to translate Rustaveli, and I think she can do it, and we need to find a publisher. And I've looked around, and the publishers are not interested because they're all invested in Marjorie Wardrope, and they have this thing. And then Nato said, well, why do we need to find a publisher? I'll become a publisher. Somebody is talking.
Somebody. That you mute yourself, please. I'll mute. Yeah, someone unmuted themselves, but I think we are all good now.
Okay, so Nato became a publisher to translate. She never published anything. And she gave me an advance to publish it. She committed her solidly behind it. She contacted people who could print out the book. She found illustrators. She did the whole thing herself. And now she's published, 7 or 8 books. She's become a little independent Georgian publisher. So we did that. And then, of course, as I translated for the anthology with Gia, I developed a great interest in Galaktion and Barbakadze. And it's been a love affair between me and Georgia and Georgian poets in particular.
Yeah, great. Well, and then you've allowed us Georgians who wanted to read it in English and enjoy it to have that opportunity. So thank you for that. But I want to pick up on one thing you said about kind of how you were unhappy with the previous translation, and sometimes it's too difficult to be dissatisfied about bad translations because we hear how uniquely challenging it is to translate Georgian, and that's something that I know from my own personal experience of trying to translate things to my wife, whether there's Georgian poems or Georgian songs or things that I try to translate for her. So tell us why you think it's so challenging to translate Georgian poetry, and how did you develop expertise to do it so wonderfully yourself? Give us some tips.
Thank you for the compliment. How did I do it? I think the main way was like, how does a musician get to Carnegie Hall, which is practice, practice, practice. So I don't know, this may shock some of you, but when I was in Tbilisi and being a co-professor to this translation course, the teacher had maybe 6 books on the art of translation in English that the students were supposed to read and comment on. And I read the first chapter of each book and I thought, oh my God, if I had read these books, I never would have become a translator. It's all about how difficult it is, how hard it is. You can't do it. It's the register of language. It's, you don't understand this. You have to spend your whole life, and then just before you die, maybe you could translate a couplet from it. I mean, it's just horrible. But we have an example, which, for example, I hadn't thought about this until now, but Nabokov, for example, translated Pushkin's Eugene Onegin. He translated it at least twice. One time he translated it and he was not very scholarly about it. And that's the translation I much prefer to the translation after he knew all this stuff about Russian and what you should and shouldn't do. I think it wrecked the translation. So I don't want to get into this too much now, but maybe questions later. For me, translation is a lot like writing a poem. There's this initial impetus, and it's true in translation, it's somebody else's words or work or experience or the feeling. But if you intuit that or you get that, a word that comes to mind is grok. I forget the science fiction writer who did that. Maybe somebody will tell me in the thing, but there was this word G-R-O-K. Grok means to understand in a really deep way, not necessarily in an analytical way. If you grok that natural, original poem, and then you try to create an equivalent experience, you try to create a poem that will give your reader the equivalent experience. So as far as challenging, English has a lot more words. I wrote it down here. It has 171,476 words, according to one estimate, to Georgians, 115,000 words. So should make translating very easy because you have all these words, but English has fewer rhymes. Georgia has, because of the case system partly and so forth, it has all these rhymes, and English has far fewer. And so that was a real challenge to translate the rhyme. And one of the things that always comes up, a lot of translators feel you shouldn't try to do the rhyme because you're going to mess it up but for me, if you write an epic, 1,661 quatrains, A, B, 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 you want the poem to be in rhyme. How could you have the knight in the panther skin without rhyme? To me, that was inconceivable. So that was a challenge, of course. But the most challenging thing was English. When I got to the end, I found out that in Georgian, every word has a certain syllable count. But in English, for example, the word sovereign, which comes up a lot in Rustaveli, you can imagine, the sovereign king, the sovereign queen, the sovereign duty. Some sites say 2 syllables and some say 3. Some people say sovereign. Some people say sovereign. Mm-hmm. And I realized that in my head, what I heard sovereign, I heard that it's 2 when it's a noun. That the sovereign gave this, but it's 3 when it's sovereign right, like sovereign duties. That's just me. But in English, it's very hard. And if you're trying to do a 16-syllable line, do you just go with 2 syllables, or do you? So I had to go through, after I translated the whole epic, and I discovered, wait a minute, sometimes I translate sovereign as 2, sometimes 3. I had to go back and figure out the English syllabification, and really that was one of the hardest parts. The last thing I'd say about difficulty is the subtlety of Georgian rhythms is amazing. And some Georgians say that there is no meter to a Georgian poem. Others say, oh no, there's, I'm working right now with Nino Darbaseli, and she's this wonderful Georgian scholar, and we're translating Razdan Gvetadze, an old poet from the Blue Horns, and I'm having a lot of challenges with that. And one of them is that she feels that it's dactylic, and you can feel the dactylic beat in the line. Other Georgians say no. So translating Georgian rhythm in an English, in a sort of appealing English way, because I think if you don't give the readers the experience, it has to read first like a poem, to my mind, and then like a Georgian poem or like Rustaveli's poem. But if it's reading like crummy prose, it's not going to they're not going to take delight in it the way Georgians take delight in Rustaveli. So there were a lot of challenges. Those are just the top ones that come to mind.
Any surprises? That anything you were surprised about that you didn't anticipate going into it?
Well, it's a surprise. It was a surprise to me that English syllabification was going to be a difficulty. And then one thing that surprised me was kind of like a mystical thing, that when it took me 2.5 years almost to translate the epic. And I'm not a sort of persistent type person. I'm like a sprinter, a short run, and to have this every day. And I was really helped that I only translated 1 chapter, never more than 1 chapter at a time, sometimes less. So that at the end, I had this cliffhanger ending that I talked about to look forward to the next. I didn't know what was going to happen, so I wanted to find out. But the surprising thing for me was that when I got really in the thick of it and really felt stymied, sometimes I would feel Rustaveli, or the ghost of Rustaveli, or the spirit of Rustaveli speaking to me and helping me out. Also, another thing, a personal thing, I worked on Rustaveli with Dodona Kaziria.
Yeah.
And she was the editor and introducer of the Georgian anthology I'd done with Gia. And I think I can say, put this delicately and still speak truthfully, we did not get along at all in the Georgian Anthology of Poetry. And the key for me was at the end, the publisher had Dodona's scholarly introduction. They asked me to write a personal note about translating it. And so I wrote this thing. It was only a page long. And it was the day before the deadline. I sent it or 2 days before, I sent it to Dodona, and I said, what do you think? And I didn't hear from her, so I told the publisher, go ahead. And then the day after the deadline, when I'd already sent in the book of things, she wrote me and she said that she was mortally offended by my introduction. And if my introduction was in the book, she didn't want to be associated with it. It was the worst thing she'd ever. What did I think I was, a white goddess talking to primitive Georgians, and to heck with me. I was completely stunned. It was a personal thing. And so, when we come down to doing Rustaveli, and Nato asked me who I wanted to work with, and I said, well, I'm not looking forward to these personality clashes and conflicts, but Dodona is a poet in her own right in English and Georgian. Her scholarship seemed to me to be impeccable. I don't know anybody else that I would want. So I wrote to her and I asked her and I said, would you do this? And she agreed, I think, with much the same feelings that I had on the other side, like, And we got along famously on Rustaveli. She loved my translation. She gave me the best help. She gave me all these little pieces. Like I remember one time she wrote me, I had it translated that somebody, Aftandil or something, walked in and was talking to the king. And she said, no, you can't have somebody standing up while the king is seated. You got to get Aftandil down. He can't be addressing the king from on high. So little things like that. Anyway, that was a wonderful surprise that we worked together so well.
It's a small world. I took a class with her my freshman year in college. Well, she was teaching at Indiana, but she came down to my undergrad to teach a Georgian literature class. It was 2008. But yeah, she's a tough person to please. I can remember that.
Right.
But so jumping to the book then, and the kind of the subjects of your latest translation of Georgian poetry, is what anything about their lives that is important to know for us, that we might that would be helpful to know as we try to understand their poetry, about Baratashvili and Tbilisi and Barbakadze.
Well, I wrote down some notes. I started translating Rustaveli knowing very well. I was helped out because there's very little is known of his life.
Right.
So I learned the 2 facts that people know about his life, but with these other poets, I started translating them without knowing much. When I was coming up to this talk, I wanted to know more, so I asked 2 people, Donald Rayfield and Levon Giganishvili, who's a Georgian scholar, a great friend and a wonderful scholar. Anyway, and so Levon said that Baratashvili lived from 1817 to 1845. He said Baratashvili was hardly a believer, as is evident in his poems. He had a crisis of faith and lost God, as he was traditionally worshipped in the church. He was not adept at Russian imperial policies, yet wanted passionately to serve in the Russian imperial army. And he talks about Baratashvili's note to his uncle, asking him to get him a job. Uncle, help me in it, for my soul cannot be contained within small confines. It desires for something greater, the infinite. And Levin says he sought to face death while keeping dignity and honor. He was a lover of wine and parties and girls, yet none of that kept him from a deep feeling of loneliness and abandonment expressed in his poems. And then Rayfield says, Baratashvili is one of the first Georgians to fire a modern nationalism with European romanticism. The tragic quality of his poetry was determined by early physical injury, his lameness, as well as by the catastrophic failure of the 1832 conspiracy in which he was a schoolboy participant. The love of his life married Prince David Dadiani. Poetry became his sole outlet. He died of malaria, unmourned and unpublished. Posthumously, as his lyrics were rediscovered between 1861 and 1876, he came to be idolized. So I thought that was interesting, that asked to give a short picture of a poet's life, 2 very knowledgeable people. It's almost like they had different poets in mind to me. One, and so Donald is more focused on the achievement, I guess, and Levon in the inner mood or whatever. So that's Baratashvili. And as far as Galaktian, Galaktian Tbilisi was 1891 to 1959. That always blows me away. 1959, so I was 16, roughly 15 or 16 when he died, without a clue, of course, that he existed. But Levin says, I think the gist of his soul's plight is the loss of faith in God. Yet he searched for a sense of eternity and the sacred, and had a certain ability to feel and even smell it. He was existentially sad, but at moments a glimpse of the eternal and divine would enlighten him, and then he was supremely joyful. He used to say, being asked how he wrote his poems, quote, sometimes I lie on the sand under the sun, and then an angel descends on me. He wrote poems to Stalin and others, probably feeling he had to show his fidelity to the regime because his wife had been sent to the Gulag in Soviet Stalinist purges. He drank a lot. He clearly felt a demonic presence in him. Shortly before committing suicide and falling from the 3rd floor of a hospital, he wrote, I see nothing but the bloody eyes of my demon. Rayfield said about him, he had a totally new talent for making Georgian a subtly onerous, almost poetic medium for conveying mood. By the 1920s, his themes were wholly his own: isolation, lovelessness, and nightmarish premonitions. And then I have here, Baratashvili's Mirani transcends historical associations and is seen through the lens of symbolism, becomes Galaktian's Blue Horses. Then Rayfield again, Galaktian was gifted with the ability to sustain an image, a rhythmic phrase, and an emotion. Snow is typical in its fantasiacal longing. So again, I just was struck by the difference between two, both knowledgeable about poetry and loving poetry, but it's almost like two different poets that they're describing. And maybe this would be a time I could read from the book if you think, or would you want to go ask me some more questions?
Sure, no, we can do. I have a couple more, and we can open up for Q&A, but we can do some reading quick.
Okay. I just wanted, since we mentioned the Mirani becoming the Blue Horses, when I was in Georgia, Mirani was, I would say, my #1 hit. Everybody, and I loved reading it, and I love the poem, and it shows, I think. I won't read the whole thing, but just, maybe you probably already know it, but it's this wonderful beginning where the rider is talking to his horse. I mean, it seems so natural, but then when you think of writing a poem, okay, I'm going to write a poem about a rider who's galloping and he's talking to his horse as he's going. Doesn't sound like it's going to be very promising. But anyway, this is Mirani, just a few verses.
Sure.
Galloping, soaring, my Mirani, through the trackless night we fly, rushing past a raven's croaking, his unblinking evil eye. Oh, Mirani, gallop onward with your great unbounded ease. Undo all my blackest thoughts, send them winging to the breeze. Cleave the wind and split the water, racing on without a goad. Onward fly in rushing gallop, shortening the lengthy road. Winged steed, don't spare yourself, race on in storm and stinging sun. Don't let your selfless, tired rider by your pity be undone. And then this line, it wasn't hard to leave my land, to leave friend after faithful friend, to tell the one I love goodbye and never see my home again. It doesn't matter night or day, or even which strange land I see, if I can share the secret of my heart with all the stars that go with me. And that stanza really struck me, how he shifts this wonderful, ironic thing about it's not hard to do what I'm doing. And the more he tells you how it's not hard, the more you realize how awful and hard it is.
Right.
And then this one at the end, instead of tears of love, I will be mourned by every morning dew. I won't hear my family crying, just a griffin caw or two. Gallop onward, my Mirani, past the bounds that fate decreed. I am free, and so are you. On we go, rider, steed. So, you certainly get the energy and the rhythm there, and but in back of that, it's interesting because it's such an energetic poem, but the mood is really, I think, akin to the mood that a lot of us have in the United States right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's very desperate, in my view, and very unhappy. Everything is unhappy. Everything is desperate. You don't see what's going to happen. It's going to all go to heck. But yet he's riding off with such energy, and knowing that he will die, this sort of tragic warrior or whatever. So, and then I thought maybe it would be good to read just a little bit of Blue Horses.
Sure. With
having the Mirani in the background. This, I think, if I had the chance to redo, well, I was going to say if I had a chance to redo any of the poems from the book, this would be the one I would choose. But that's probably not true. It's very, very difficult. It's maybe the most difficult poem I've ever had to translate. And I talked to all these people and read all these, and because there's so much nonsense as well as sense in there, so much that's personal, so much that, and I think if you can, the lines are long and sometimes for me lose some of the pulse, but it sort of comes close almost to prose, but then it recoils. And I think it's a fascinating poem. And especially knowing the background of Marani, that he took that and then he twisted that, in my view, or expanded that. Anyway, I'll read the first half maybe. Mist there was adrift like snow, though the setting sun's bright glow helped make the eternal shore shine as if in days of old. Promises would not be seen. There was nothing one could see, only cold and homeless silence, only cold marauding, only homeless silence there, only the marauding cold. There on the eternal shore, sorrow showed what it could do. No one's eye holds any spark. You lie in the tomb in dark. You lie there in darkness dressed. How your soul is now distressed. Faces crazed like bony trees, lifeless days are rushing past. How they scurry, how they run, runners racing very fast. My blue horses bearing dreams carry you on wooden bier. My blue horses run to me, they come, and everyone is here. And one of the things that makes it so, he's got so much internal rhyme, so much, and he's not afraid to, I'm sorry, Catherine, so I wonder if she could stop doing exercises. I see his arm, or yeah, I'm sure it helps, but I'm sorry, but it's just, I'm seeing all this. Okay, so like it takes, so only cold and homeless silence, only cold marauding. So cold is used as an adjective for silence, at least if I remember correctly. I may have altered this or tweaked this, but then it becomes a noun, only cold marauding. And in the next line, it becomes marauding cold, where the marauding goes to becoming the adjective, and then cold is the noun. So, and then there's all this, the shore shine and the glow, the show, the whatever. When I was reading this book, I discovered one of the sad little things that happens when you look through books you've already published. I discovered a terrible typo in the first line. So in the poem, it's mist there was adrift like snow, though the setting sun's bright glow. And in the book, it has through, which makes no sense at all. So it's like, oh. But anyway, that's what happens. So anyway, very difficult, but very rewarding poem, I think. Yeah. And the common thing I would say is the despair. The despair, and yet Galactian too, the energy has become less his. You know, now he's summoning his blue horses, run to me. Right. And the blue horses are doing stuff. He's mainly on the sidelines. Unlike Baratashvili, he's not actually riding the horse.
Yeah. Thank you. And okay, one last question from me. And for those of you, we'll start taking your questions. So simple instruction: if you have a question, just put a Q in the chat, and I'm gonna call on you in the order that your questions come in. So when I call your name, you can unmute yourself and ask your question verbally. So yeah, put a Q in the chat, and if you have a question, and I'll call on you. But my last question, Lyn, I have a couple more, but I'll keep my very, very last one for the last to wrap up the conversation. But for now, you talked about Tbili's suicide, and there's a story or that supposedly he, that kind of just the day before his death, he asked his cousin or his niece to bring his copy of vepkhistyaosani to him at the hospital. And having done a translation of it, and maybe this fact doesn't surprise you, it certainly doesn't surprise me, because I think more than any text, I would argue it's something that shapes us Georgians and what we are supposed to aspire to be like, and what should we be as humans, that book. So it's understandable for me that he would ask for that book. So I wanted to ask you, in the process of translation, and you talked about how you were kind of grabbed by the book immediately. Do you have a favorite theme in the book, or a scene that's kind of especially stayed with you and comes back to you that you want to tell us about from vepkhistyaosani?
Sure. I always think maybe this question should be asked in reverse. Is there any theme that did not resonate with you? Because that's much easier. What I didn't like in Rustaveli, he sometimes has very long lists. Like at a wedding, they had the lotus, and they had the golden chalices, and they had the wine like thing, and they had the cookies, and they had the whatever. It's like, okay, enough of that. Except for that, I think it's safe to say that I loved almost everything. I mean, there's the aphorism, the one about the lions' whelps are equally lions, male or female though they be. Of course, what modern woman wouldn't? I mean, that could have been written tomorrow. It's great. But my favorite passage, and I have it here, is
I read it.
At the very end of the poem, the very quatrain. It's summing up. It's summing up the happy ending of these two kingdoms that have been set, and they're both setting things to right, political rightness. And it was a difficult quatrain to translate because there are several nouns that have to be used exactly. But this is the way I have it here. Their kingly mercy was given to all. It fell like endless snow. The poor stopped begging, widows felt safe, and orphans were helped to grow. Evildoers were scared. Their ewes had lambs, but no milk to bestow. In the realm of their kingdoms, the goat with the wolf could safely go. And my favorite part of that, I love it all, but my favorite part is this idea that the evildoers had ewes that had lambs, but they had no milk to bestow the lambs. So in other words, you still had people doing evil, but it didn't continue. It got snuffed out. And you're always going to have somebody trying to do something, make a mischief, do something wrong. But it didn't last because their mercy was falling like endless snow. And then in terms of scenes, I love the humor that's underneath a lot of Rustaveli. For example, I came to it from King Arthur and his knights. And so then you have this knight, and the first thing you know about him, he's off his horse and he's crying. And that, to me, I mean, a knight crying? How does this happen? I was just completely shocked, because in King Arthur, none of the knights that I can remember, they never cried. No matter what happened, they would not cry. And then when you find out that they cry not only for themselves, but even more in a way for their friend. If their friend has something wrong, they cry because of the friend's plight. And if they don't feel like crying, they hit their head against a wall until they feel like crying. I just love these emotional feminine knights weeping and crying. And I loved it that when Aftandil goes off, he tells Tariel that he's going to come and help him on his quest, give up everything. He becomes more important even than his beloved Tinatin. He's going to devote everything to Tariel, to this male bonding and this love. And he said, I only has one thing. I'm going to go months home to tell my betrothed that I'm not going to stay there. I'm going to come back and I'm going to help you find your fiance. And I only want one thing from you. Don't go anywhere. And Tariel swears he's not going to go anywhere. Aftandil comes back. Tariel's nowhere to be seen. I love that. He's his hero. He promised one thing to his friend. Promise I'll be here. He's not there. And then when Aftandil goes looking for him, where does he find him? He's collapsed in a bush, all bloody, with the carcasses of a tiger and a lion. next to him. And then right on top of that, the psychology that Rustaveli he's just spot on. I'm a social worker by training and spent a decade in social work. So you have Tariel's completely desperate, can't go on with his life, please just kill me. And Aftandil tries and tries to persuade him, and he can't get him. So he says, this wonderful man says, okay, I tell you what, I'll do what you say, but first get on your horse. Tariel gets on his horse, and of course, now he's Tariel on a horse. He forgets all about committing suicide. And it's just the act of getting back in the saddle. No words are going to persuade him, but the act of getting back in the saddle. So, and the last thing I'll say is my favorite scene, which I acted in Sweden, in a castle in Sweden with a Swedish actor. I was Asmat, and he was Aftandil. And this wonderful scene where Aftandil has tracked Tariel to his lair, and he doesn't want to approach Tariel directly. So he's going to find out his story from Asmat. And he comes to Asmat, he says, oh, Asmat, don't be afraid of me. I'm just here to get the story, please. And Asmat is running and shrieking, and it irritates Asmat. So he grabs her and he puts his knife to her throat. I'm going to kill you if you don't tell me. I mean, 2 minutes, 2 seconds after saying how he's a friend and now he's got his knife to her throat. And she says, go ahead and kill me. I don't care. Life is nothing to me. It's a straw. So then he says, okay, I won't kill you, but I'm only doing this because I'm in love, and it's all out of love, and I'm sorry that I put my knife to her throat. And Asmat says, oh, if it's for love, that's okay. And now I want to serve you and be your best friend, and I'll do anything to help you. So you have in one page people threatening to kill each other. It's like opera, you know. And then when she hides him and Tariel comes back and she says, you know, Tara, you've been hanging out with the animals too much. You need a good male friend. He says, I know, but where could I find such a one? He'd have to be a knight. He'd have to be out here. Nobody's going to be. And she says, yes, but if I found such a one, if there were such a one, just improbably so, you'd have to promise not to kill him. And Tara says, no, I wouldn't kill him. I'd embrace him as a brother. And she says, okay, Aftandil, come on out. So he comes out, and then they're brothers. It's just wonderful. And it's like humanity written large. So that's what I have to say about that.
Like, I think maybe our next project could be, we could have a kind of a book club on vepkhistyaosani, maybe a few meetings where a group of us can read in advance and then discuss the book with you in several sessions. I think that
would be great. As I sort of told you, just an hour before this meeting, I got an email, just a phone call from my cousin who's in Pennsylvania. We hardly ever speak, but I love this man. He's also a poet. And he said he was teaching high school seniors English language arts, and they were focusing on epic poetry. And he said, okay, so you don't like Beowulf is too depressing and Gilgamesh is too sad. Let's go to the internet and see what we can find. So they go to the internet. He said, oh, here's a language I don't know. Let's open this up and see. And then it says, it's Rustaveli from the Georgians, translated by Lyn Coffin. He says, oh, I know her. And so they started, he said, we proceeded to read it out loud. And the students loved it. And they said, you know, it's just kind of great. It's positive, it's energizing. And I don't know where my future is going to take me. And here are men struggling, and even the women struggling to figure out what the future is going to hold with great energy and passion and conviction. And so I was like, whoa, I love it. So thank you. I'd love to do that.
Great, wonderful. All right, sounds good. I'll go to questions now. So again, as a reminder, if you have a question for Lyn, just put a Q in the chat, and then I'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself and ask the question verbally. So I see one question from Nikoloz. Actually, he's the one who gifted me your book. So let's see.
Where are you? Nikoloz, there you are.
Hi, Lyn. Thank you for an interesting conversation. I also want to thank Valerian and the Georgian Association for organizing this talk. Since there are not that many questions yet, I'll dare to ask two, if I may. So the first question I wanted to ask
it depends on the first one. If I like the first one.
Okay, let's do the deal. So the first question is, from your perspective as a poet, I wonder, what do you think is a metric to measure a poem? What makes a great poem a great poem? Is it an imagery? Is it the rhyme? what is it?
Yes. That's the answer. When it is this or this, where there are two alternatives, take the third. Yeah, I mean, you know, this is like a wolf in sheep's clothing. I mean, this is the essential question that people, you know, what makes it great? And all kinds of quotations are rushing into my head. People have different metrics, and I think one of the great things about Rustaveli is whatever metric you apply, he makes it. So, and Shakespeare the same way. So, is it images? Oh my God, the images in Rustaveli. Is it rhythm and rhyme and color? Yes. Is it psychology? Yes. Is it humor? Yes. Is it wisdom? Yes. For me, it's hard to say. Like when I've written a couple of poems that I think are good, and is it touching? Well, I think I'm a Buddhist, so it's like a good poem is like the finger pointing at the moon. So the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, but it's pointing accurately at the moon. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, a good poem, I respond on many levels. Like with Rustaveli, just the sound, I respond like on a vibrational level. But then the image, the crystallization of the evildoers with their lambs that they don't have any milk for. I mean, that's a great image for what you can achieve in a just society. And it's all of that and everything. And what do you think? What do you think? Let me turn it back on you.
I mean, I think it was very interesting for me to hear from you about the number of rhymes in Georgian. And for me, rhymes have always been an important component of a poem. For me, growing up reading and learning by heart Georgian poems, it was difficult sometimes in other languages to perceive something as a poem if it wasn't rhymed. So for me, rhyme is definitely a big component. And then I agree, it's different things together, imagery and the wisdom as well. But as I said, for me, it's difficult to perceive it as a poem if it's not rhymed.
Okay, let me stop you then before you ask the second question, because I want to do something sort of interesting. As you said, there's not many. So this is a poem, a poem I like quite a lot from Dato. It's not rhymed at all. And some people would think it's close to prose, but I'm going to read it. It's not that long, and it's Still Life with Snow. So this compares to the other Georgian Tovli and the poems about snow.
Yes.
So Still Life with Snow. On airy balconies, heavy houses, speeding cars, all these snows, snow burying its head in someone's airy balcony, or living on the roof of an instantaneous car, or running stealthily after silly children, lost street by street, all these snows. Or at night in small parks of gathered friendships, trampled by thousands of feet, all these hearts of all these snows fall like silent touches, unnoticed reprimands. The whole life of half-melted snow, sunrise to sunset, the whole half-melted life of snow. And every day this or that person wakes up to a this or that surprise that this snow is completely other. And under the cover of some other unknown snow, an everyday other unknown person sees another dream, and in the dream, more than one other snow. In a corner of the house, unnoticed, it is bitterly burying its head, or step by step, ascending a mountain's far off slopes, or paling after chasing silly children, or, as it often happens, failing to fall.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely a poem.
That's definitely a poem. I think it's You know, there's a Georgian name for a poem that doesn't have a rhyme. It's called a white poem. For me, it's a white poem, and it's definitely a poem. But again, you know, it's of course a personal subjective opinion. But for me, a great poem should have a rhyme. It should also have other things, and just a rhyme doesn't make it a great poem.
I love that you say that, because now in America anyway, in the US, there is a feeling for the last 20, 40 years that rhyme makes an inferior poem. Only inferior poets rhyme, because it reveals that you are searching, that you're crafting a poem. And there's this feeling that poems have to be genuine. They have to come right out of your subconscious, and they have to, if you rhyme them, then you're straining, your mind is getting in, well, what's a rhyme for this, and so forth. And so it's really great to hear, you know.
Well, maybe that perspective also assumes that everyone needs to strain to produce a rhymed poem naturally.
Yeah.
Can I ask a second question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So the second question is related to my experience learning Georgian poems in school, which is not a unique experience for, as you might know, most students in middle school and high school in Georgia learn poems, including sections from vepkhistyaosani by heart.
Come here.
And it can be a pretty difficult experience at that age, especially to learn sections from vepkhistyaosani by heart. And I'm curious, in your perspective, about the virtues or not so much of learning poems by heart.
Well,
in education system, I mean, because I've also spent some time in school in the US, and every time we came across a poem, we would read it, but it was never required to learn it by heart.
Okay, so it's interesting because, as if you remember, I've neglected to put in that little bit of information at the beginning. My father would pay $1 a poem at the dinner table if it was memorized. You couldn't read a poem, you had to recite a poem from memory. So as I was going up the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. That's still in my consciousness, word for word, rhyming. So I think in general that there are some children for whom this would be a great thing, and an equally large number for whom this would be a terrible thing to do to them. Where those children want to start, in fact, it's interesting with rhyme. Rhyme is a big help in memorizing.
Yes.
So that's one thing. My granddaughter memorized The Raven when she was like 11. I was amazed that she memorized this huge song. But so that can help some children develop their own native sense of rhyme and rhythm and liking. But there's more than half that I would say, when I was teaching in the grade school and elementary and high school, I would forbid the students to rhyme. You are not allowed to rhyme in your poem, because I didn't want, they'd get this cat, bat, sad kind of thing, and it was dreadful.
Yeah.
So you have to find, so we did it like haiku for those students. Moment, some without the rhyme, and that seemed to work a lot better. So, you know, different strokes for different folks, which is a rhyme.
Yeah.
And, you know, aphorisms, it's nice and helps, but I personally have witnessed a devastation when I was in Georgia, and so excited to be working on vepkhistyaosani, and people say, "Oh yeah, I had to memorize. Oh, that was a terrible thing."
Yes.
And then I got it for my wedding. What a burden! What am I stuck it under the sink as soon as I could? I mean, it's like, no, you can read it in the original. It's this wonderful thing, and they'd be like, "Really? You like it?" So they were completely ruined by their teacher's insistence on
yes, I agree. I think it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to slightly disagree. I think it is for everyone. It's just that the approach has to be a little bit tailored to different, different people. You cannot force a 7th grader vepkhistyaosani and make them memorize it, especially when you take away the meaning of it. So the part of the issue was that it's not that, you know, if you're telling students that, oh, you need to memorize this because we are telling you need to memorize it and it's important, of course there's going to be a resistance, and you're going to actually create this kind of hostility towards it. But if you teach them the meaning, and like the way you described it, the humor, the important themes there, then they're gonna cherish it and hold on to it for the rest of their lives. So it is for everyone, but not everyone knows how to teach it.
Well, I think for me, it just occurred to me, here's a provocative thesis, that the teachers like to have students memorize things in the same way that teachers like to later, like in college, they like to read essays by the poet to explain the poetry or the poem. And I think they're both ways that a teacher can relax. they can know that they're going to be right. So they have a copy of the poem and they're following along, and they know every time the student makes a mistake, and they don't have to deal with their own reaction to the poem. And the same with, I object to people, we're doing a poetry group now, and we're studying Marianne Moore, and she's kind of difficult. So people want to go and read what she said her poems mean. Well, Robert Frost, for example, I don't think he had a clue what his poems mean. I mean, I think he went about it, there's the essayist or the scholar, and then there's the poet, or in some cases the translator. And I think they're very different. They're left brain and right brain kinds of things. But I think one of the things that people have students memorize poetry is because it gives the teacher something really easy to grade.
Yeah.
And they don't have to do anything. They just have to follow along.
Yeah, and it's just not a healthy habit to also instill in children, just a pure memorization, just no critical thinking, which can be pretty harmful in the long term. Great. Any other questions? I have a.
Thank you, Lyn.
Yeah, sure. I'm really disheartened. There's only Robert A. Heinlein is the only other question.
No, that was an answer to one of, I think you were asking about. So Nikoloz.
Oh, right. The grokking. Yeah. What was the book?
Ken, do you know the book? Maybe Ken. Is Ken still here?
Yes, I do know the book. That's from Stranger in a Strange Land. Stranger in
a Strange Land. Yeah, thank you. That's it. Thanks a lot. Otherwise, I would have been racking my brains. So don't you have a question, Ken? You have a great answer, but how about a great question?
No, I enjoy poetry tremendously, and have known Shota Rustaveli's poem for 20 years, but thank you very much for the discussion. No questions.
Right. Have you ever heard of Yeji Orten?
I have not. I'm just learning voraciously about Georgian culture now.
Right. Yeah. Just a great poet. Okay. How about
maybe Lyn, want to tell us a little bit more about? Oh, there's a question from Megan. I was going to ask about if you can tell us a little bit about Dato Barbakadze, but there's a question from Megan. So let's go to Megan.
Hey, I had a question. This is coming from someone who's very new to everything that you talked about. You mentioned that you are personally Buddhist, and it seems like a lot of the themes and the works you talked about are very Christian. So can you talk about what are some of the biggest religious themes in the works that you've translated? And how do you think that people today can relate to them being from such a long time ago? You were talking about how the mood of it reminds you of what's happening in the US.
Right. Well, it's wonderful questions, two questions. And the first one, it came up a lot with Rustaveli. So Rustaveli, everybody knows that Rustaveli wrote the great Christian Testament of Georgia. Well, he doesn't mention Georgia, and he doesn't mention Jesus. And he doesn't talk about the Virgin Mary, and he doesn't talk about the triumvirate. And how Christian can it be? I've had big arguments with Levon Giganishvili, who says that, well, but you know, it expresses a Christian ideal, which is be kind. Well, a lot of religions express. So it's like Rustaveli set out, you know, all the countries he mentions, like 6 countries. He mentions India, and he mentions Egypt, he mentions whatever. He does not mention Georgia. The only time it gets kind of local is in the talk about Queen Tamar. And one side note, while I'm thinking of this, another thing that I love about the humor in Rustaveli, he talks about he's in love with Queen Tamar and he idolizes her. And he says, you know, it's a little bit hard to be in love with a woman where if you tick her off, she could not only kill you, but your family, your whole village, the whole country. 2,000 men could die because you made her irritated. So, but anyway, so the religion in Rustaveli, it's not Christian in my view. People go, in fact, the only gods there are mentioned are like the polytheistic god, Mars and Mercury and Jupiter and so forth. You really have to want Rustaveli to be a Christian testament to make it a Christian testament. Buddhism, technically, I don't know if you know this, it's not a religion because it doesn't presuppose a belief in God. Some people have said that Buddhism is really a practice. There's a book by Stephen Batchelor I like a lot called Buddhism Without Beliefs. You don't have to have any beliefs. It's generally thought to be a good idea to meditate. That's about it. So for me, that was one thing. In Baratashvili and Galaktion, religion is there in the background, but they have a more troubled relationship with it than I do. They're always, you know, they're kicking around old cathedrals and monasteries. They, as Levon said, they seem to have a loss of faith and a troubled relationship with religion. So, and I personally, as a poet and a translator, I try to stay away from intention. People talk a lot about intention as, and like I've been an actor for a while. You can see movies of my little clips of me on YouTube as an actress. And everywhere I went for a long time, people were talking about intentions. What's your intention? To me, the author's intention doesn't compute. It's the intention of the poem. It's what the poem is saying. And part of this is because when I was a teacher in college at the University of Michigan, I taught creative writing, and I had a kid write a wonderful, wonderful allegory. And everybody loved it. And it was a protest against his strict Catholic upraising and upbringing. And people started saying, this is a wonderful expose of the hypocrisy of Catholic parents. And he was just shocked out of his mind. No, I'm trying to be very good and religious. So one thing about the religion, I don't know if that answers your question exactly, or if you wanted to.
Well, could I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Okay, because I just downloaded your book, the translation of the Night of Rustaveli's Night in Panther Skin. And so the prologue is like, you know, he who created heaven and earth
Right.
out of his power and might, and, you know, the Holy Spirit, and he's talking about like dissolving sins. So that seems pretty Christian,
Right.
But I get your point.
You're
if
right.
He's not mentioning
You've hit upon
Jesus.
the most Christian part of the book. You're right.
Oh, okay. Well, I just literally only read the first page. So.
No, right. Well, that's it. It's the first stanza, the first line, it gets progressively less Christian. And there is reference to God, but there's also reference to gods. And, oh, will the gods help me? And will the gods not? And I'm going to, and then talk about Mars and Mercury and stuff. But basically, there's not much of that either, in my view. I mean, there's 1,661 quatrains, and most of that is humanistic. It's about people struggling to love each other, or to defeat their enemies, to accomplish their purposes. And some of it is, you know, so anyway, yeah, but you're right.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, thanks so much. I look forward to reading it then.
And what was the second part? You had a second question. That
was yeah, I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on the part you said that you felt like the mood of, I think it was from some other poem, I can't remember which poet now, maybe of Tbilisi.
Right,
I'm sorry, I can't say his name. Yeah, you're saying the mood of a lot of his poems reminds you of the mood of the US today, and how a lot of people, you know, are kind of feeling despondent, like everything's going to hell right now. Could you talk a little bit more about how you see the similarities? And I mean, you just briefly mentioned that, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the more irresponsible things that I've said. I mean, it's way out there, but you know, I'm an inveterate lefty, and again, I don't, you know, I don't write like leftist poems or whatever. I don't, because that's when I set out with an intention, I can't write a poem. It becomes a political ad or something. But if I write the poem and I get inspired, like I've had a couple of poems. One poem was inspired by a dream, and I just pretty much wrote it down. That was one of the best poems that I've written. It sort of wrote itself. And then sometimes I can discover a message in that. I think the message that the poet's trying to say, which is not my own, I don't know, it gets kind of weird. But yeah, I don't really want to get into that, because then I'll become all soggy, and that'll be the end of our talk. I hope that we're coming, you know, I don't know, just to me, the climate, I spend every day doing fact check on everything everybody says. And you know, I'm a Biden supporter, but he has minor fact checks. I wish he'd just get it straight. Stop telling people what's not true. It's not true that, you know, anyway. So, but let's not get me started on that. I once ran for office years ago, and you can still tell. I was elected in New Jersey as a concerned Democrat thousands of years ago.
Great. Thank you, Megan. We have one question from Madonna.
Where's Madonna?
Madonna, do we still have you?
Yeah, hi. So we're children, and hi. And our grandmother doesn't speak English, and she's very passionate about Georgian literature. We're actually learning vepkhistyaosani right now, and I think it would be very useful to have that English translation to help us, since she is unable to do so. And we were just wondering what the most difficult part of this whole process was for you. Was it the rhyming, getting the emotion through, just very technical stuff such as words and such?
It's a good question. It's difficult because right now I'm in the middle of this translation project with another Georgian poet who's not well known, Rajden Gretadze. And it's like having a love affair. You forget how you were with the previous husband or lover or whatever, because you're with this one now, and that's sort of absorbs your whole mind.
Yeah, I understand. I've been there.
Right. Yeah, so yeah, it's human. So it's hard for me to remember, but I think as I mentioned, that the Blue Horses is probably the most difficult poem I've had to translate, because it's so rich in rich in rhythm, rhyme, internal rhyme, themes, and there was a line like I loved in that poem he has about that the faces is crazed like bony trees. No, faces crazed like bony trees. That, I mean, I think it's very powerful. It doesn't make any logical sense. What a bony tree? Why is that? How does a crazed face look like a bony tree? But it works. So I think there was no sort of overriding difficulty. There was just the individual difficulty with individual poems, especially with Galaktion. I would recommend starting somewhere else. There's an anthology, the first anthology I did, it's out of Slavica, Indiana University. It starts with Rustaveli, and it has a poem like Baratashvili. If you tell her, there's one, he has a poem called Earring.
Yes, I would.
You know that one?
Yeah, we're familiar.
Yeah, so it's really, it's like a butterfly swings a lily stretching high, spotless lily, sunny day, just so her earring, exquisite earring, has begun a shadow play. So it's a charming, very well-written poem about this earring. And I think if you're trying to learn Georgian, I don't know, cross-cultural explorations, or start with Dato Barbakadze.
If only we had the same matter.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Anyway, good for you. I'm glad you're doing that. I think the more cross-cultural and cross-linguistic adventures we have in the world, the better off we'll be.
My grandmother will wholeheartedly agree.
Great.
Thank you. Right, next question we have from Lado.
Hi, Lado.
Hi, Ms. Coffin. Thank you so much for your very interesting talk, and thank you for the organization for organizing this talk. I just wanted to ask, how have the different languages you have translated poetry from affected your own poetry? Have they kind of changed the way you think about writing your own poetry, or kind of are the properties of the poetry you feel kind of more language specific, where kind of it's tough to cross-pollinate into English?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and very difficult question. One answer I'd say, which is not an answer at all, is that I would be the last person to know. It's my view. I mean, you're asking me a scholar's question about my poetry. And I try not to think about questions like that, because that definitely interferes with my writing.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure that the richness, like, so I've translated from Belgian, from Czech, from Spanish, from Russian, from Georgian, from Iranian. And I would say that the most influential on my own poetry has been Mohsen Emadi, who's a wonderful Iranian exiled poet living in Mexico now. And he and I became friends through Orten. He was translating Orten into Iranian and wrote me. He came across my book, and so we started corresponding. And then I went down to see him and ended up translating his work. He's a wonderful volume in English. It's the name of which is now blotting. What is it called? Could you look up Mohsen Emadi? And I'd like to get the name straight. On Earth, Standing on Earth. And it's a very good collection of poetry. His work definitely influenced me in some ways, and also Orten. I became friends with his brother. His brother wrote me a letter saying his brother didn't know about the existence of my translation and happened to be going down a street in Prague and went into a used bookstore and found my translation. And he spoke English beautifully. He was a BBC announcer during the war, and he was just blown away. And he said that he could now die a happy man. These are the poems my brother would have written if he'd written in English. And he wrote this to me, and that's one of the highest. I just felt completely affirmed and so grateful to get that letter. I don't know how the work has, I think anything influences you, right? You're sort of like a sponge and you're going through the thing and it's altering, everything alters everything. I belong to this Buddhist group called the Order of Interbeing, and you see how everything is connected and in the most wonderful way. And so I hope that as I'm a good reader, if I'm a good reader of poetry, which I hope I am, that it will inform my own work. But I don't know how. It would take a scholar. So supposedly somebody's writing a dissertation on my work in Georgia, and maybe she can figure it out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you were going to talk about the projects coming up.
I have a couple more questions, and then at the end, I'm going to ask you about your upcoming projects. Does that sound good? There are a couple more questions.
Sure.
Yeah. So we have Jacob.
Oh, can we stop before that? Can we go to Paul Joyal? In your description of poetry, I was surprised that the role and power of emotion and the ability to evoke emotions was not included. Can you comment on this? Yes, I should have included it. That's my comment, of course, especially with lyrical poetry, but with any maybe I take it for granted as sort of like yes, it definitely speaks to the emotional, the emotions in a way that prose usually fails to. It's a very deep and emotional response. That's what I meant about being the whole being response, not just emotions, but certainly including them, and physically and psychologically and rationally. I mean, a really good poem, I think, reaches you, and there's no level at which it does not reach.
Yeah, I think that emotion is very strong in the Georgian culture as well. And so I thought I'd bring that up.
Right. No, I'm very glad you did.
But I'm very pleased that your father introduced you to Robert Service.
Oh, you know about Robert Service.
By the barge of Lake Labarge, there took place the cremation of Sam McGee.
There you go.
I think that if we could take a poet and transport him in Georgia, he'd fit right in. I spent some time in the Yukon territories and was captivated by Service and his poetry.
Yeah.
And of course, and I lived on Lake Labarge.
Oh, so, there you go.
So it was quite an experience. Anyways, I was very pleased to hear that.
Right. Great. Well, what I could say let me just say what I always say about Georgians. People, I mean, there are quite a lot of Georgians here, but the Georgians are the most generous people on the planet. And I think nobody can dispute this. I remember a time I was having dinner in a restaurant, and this woman and I had tried very long time to get together, and she said, well, I can't join you for dinner, but I can come and have a cup of coffee. So she came to have a cup of coffee, and then she insisted on paying for the whole dinner, including my dinner. I was like, you were here for 5 minutes of the coffee and you're paying. But, you know, it's just like, it was a wonderful experience. And the joyfulness, when I first went there, I didn't know anybody, and I was Gia Jokadze's guest, and I was invited to a lot of the supras. And the bad part, or the politically incorrect part, was that they were all men. But I was invited there because I didn't know Georgian well enough. They could feel free to do what they, and at the end they said, no, you can't come to supers anymore because you understand too much. But to have a Georgian, I don't think it's a great experience. One of the world's great experiences. You go to this meal and there's 50 men sitting around and they're drinking beer usually and eating up a storm. And then one of them starts to sing, and everybody begins to sing a cappella in 5-part harmony, 6-part harmony. Everybody knows the words, everybody knows the tune. And just, even now, just thinking of it makes the hair just, if you heard Georgian music, I mean, it's incredible. And then they're dancing and they're joking and whatever. And it's just incredible. No,
it's a great experience. I've had a love affair with the country ever since my first visit in '91. Luckily, I was there in October with my wife and some friends and introduced them to the, after many, many trips over the years and time in Georgia, my wife was thrilled to see Georgia as it is now, because she heard the horror stories of me being in the Civil War and no heating and no lights and this, that, and the other. She was always afraid to go. And now, of course, it's a remarkable country.
Yeah.
And the people, of course, the heart and soul of the country is its people. And, you know, the guest is the gift from God. So it's a remarkable place. And I'm so glad to meet you virtually.
Yeah.
I have ordered the book on Amazon, and looking forward to reading more of your fine efforts.
Great, thank you very much.
We can credit Rustaveli for all those good qualities that us Georgians have. Yeah, especially generosity, right? The one that whatever you give away is yours, and whatever you keep to yourself is lost forever. I think that's like the guiding principle that follows all of us Georgians everywhere we go.
Okay, that's another. Yeah, go ahead.
No. So, Lyn, do you want us to? So, I think we are close to time. So, yeah, I can ask about your future projects, and we wrap it up there. Or do you have time to take some couple of other questions together?
Sure. Well, let me tell you about the future projects, and people can So I talked mentioned several times of this new translation thing, but what I want to say is this Saturday, my novel is being published by the same publisher that published 3 Centuries, 3 Poets. That's what they assure me, although I have not seen the proofs of it yet. So I wonder how they're going to send me the proofs and say you have an hour to correct these proofs and get them back to us. I don't know. But anyway, it took me quite a long time. I think it's a good book. I'm as proud of it as I can be of prose. And I hope you'll get, it's called The Aftermath, and it's from Adelaide, the same people that did 3 Centuries. Mm-hmm. And then there's another, I was also going to have published my novella, which is called Tinder, and it's about a series of emails back and forth between an older woman, which is a thinly disguised, not even disguised really, me and a younger guy. And so this was to be published on September 6th. And 3 weeks before it was to be published, the publisher, very beginning, they haven't published anything yet, but anyway, they wrote me and they said they weren't going to publish it at all. And forget about it. And this is after working for a year on it, and they were just supposedly designing the cover and everything. So I was very saddened by that. And so if any of you know an independent publisher who would like I mean, it's certain to be a bestseller. It's based on this dating site, Tinder, that's gotten to be kind of well known. And it's you know, sort of a scam. Is there a scam? And if there's a scam, who's scamming who? And I think it ends up both of these books deal with inflammatory topics. The novel deals with a very tragic thing that happens at the beginning, but then by the end it morphs into something different. And I hope you will, you know, when you go to Adelaide to buy 3 Centuries, buy my novel as well. It won't be available till next week.
Great. And you mentioned potential.
Oh yeah.
So about the screenplay for vepkhistyaosani.
Yeah, if there's this, who is your screenplay contact? That I want, the next dream of my life is to write a screenplay for a movie to be done in English in Georgia about the story of vepkhistyaosani, to have the you know, King Tamar and Tinatin and all Aftandil and Tario put on the screen. I mean, it's so cinematic. It's the most cinematic poem I can imagine. And so if you know any Georgian filmmakers or English filmmakers that would like to, I have some experience writing screenplays, not much, but I didn't have much experience translating epics either before I ran into Rustaveli. So
Great.
Full of ideas. So please, you know, anybody that has any connections anywhere, let me know.
I'll let me drop your email in here in chat if people want to reach out. Does that sound good?
That's fine.
And then okay, so we had Jacob. If you want to ask your question, sorry, we interrupted you.
Right.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Very fascinating talk. I'm just curious. I don't think you've talked very much yet about your process of learning Georgian. You mentioned a lot of other languages as well that you translate from, so that's extremely impressive. But of course, Georgian is a very special language. As somebody who has made some basic efforts myself to learn basic Georgian, hasn't gotten very far. I'm curious to hear what it was like for you, and if you have any tips, and what it's like to work with this language, in particular Georgian.
Well, that's a great question, and it's there's a reason that I didn't talk about. I at one point I was able to defeat common Georgians in the little linguistic duel that happens in the street. So I would go to a Georgian, I'd ask in Georgian, where's the dry cleaners or whatever. He would know from my accent and horrible mishmashing of Georgian that I was probably from England or America, and he would answer in English. It's just down the corner around the bend. And I would say, but what are its hours in Georgian? So we'd have this like duel, my bad Georgian, his bad English. And by the time I left Georgia 2 years ago, roughly, I was able to win out. He would eventually start speaking Georgian. Before that, I would always cave in and give up and start speaking English. So at least I had that, but I don't really know many of the languages that I've translated from. I don't really know. I know, you know, I'm in the process of learning them. Like when I'm with Georgian, now I've given up because I'm back here. There's no Georgian cues. There's nothing, and so now I'm regretting it because I'm translating a Georgian poet again. But I translate people sometimes from languages that I really don't know. And I often, when I can, I work with the author, like with Mohsen doing the Iranian, and with, you know, I worked with a Spanish poet, and so it's, oh, I know the Belgian was Drugenbrut, Germain Drugenbrut. He and I were on this committee of the World Association of Poets, and he asked me to work with him in translating his book. And I said, he asked me what my price would be, and I said, I don't know, and blah, blah, blah. So finally he said, how about if I fly you to Spain and you stay at my villa overlooking the Mediterranean for 2 weeks, and we'll work together, and that'll be, I said, great. So he flew me over there. I had room and board in this castle. It was a wonderful experience. So, but again, I don't really know the language. And scholars get very shocked. I remember, okay, I'll tell you one story. When I was in Georgia, and my friend, the philosopher, asked me if I'd like to meet some philosophers and talk about Rustaveli. And I said, it sounded like fun, you know, coffee, talk about philosophy. So I get to the institute, and he says, okay, and he opens the door, and I walk in, and there's the whole institute is lined up. And there's a table with me to sit at with the water and the microphone and the head of the institute. And it's like a grilling, really. It's like everybody's there to question me. And the general feeling is that I shouldn't have done this. And one man says, you can't translate Rustaveli unless you know all of Neoplatonic thought. And I said, well, I don't really know Neoplatonic thought at all, but I bet you do. And he said, yes, I do. And I said, who is the Neoplatonic person that, you know, I especially should read? And I forget who he said now. But anyway, he gave me a name. And I said, and you've read all his works, I bet. He said, you bet I've read every single thing he's ever written. And I said, in Greek? And then he kind of, and everybody laughed because he read it in Georgian translation. And I said to them what I really feel, that my translation, say, of Rustaveli, of course, it's not going to be as good as Rustaveli in the original. That nobody could be that except Rustaveli himself. But it will be better than any other translation. That's my goal, is to be better, to be a closer look at some of these people. And I working with, like a story that I told you about Orten's brother that said, I can now die a happy man. I didn't know Czech very well. I had lived there for half a year. I knew some Czech. I was able to read a little bit, but I had to work and depend very heavily on Czech native speakers. And so for me, it's not in a way, like with Nabokov, in a way, the knowing of it, the having of this language, and saying, now I know this language, now I'm a scholar of this language, I know this thing, can work against people, can be a sense like a deadening, now you've done it. But with me, it's always a struggle. So I, you know, when I left Georgia, I was able to read it pretty well. I was able to read Rustaveli mainly because looking up every other word. But I'm not, I mean, some people are, it's very controversial and problematic. Some people find it just outrageous. How can you translate a poet from a language you don't really know? And it's a mystery. But I do feel it's worth it, and I do feel that I have great love and respect for the languages that I work with. And Georgian was the only language that I came to when I came to Tbilisi and saw all the words. You can't even, you know, it's not like in Moscow, you can make out most of the words that are there if you know the Cyrillic alphabet, but Georgian. So it's a very far cry. And I think Marjorie Wardrop probably knew Georgian better than I do, but I don't think it helped her much.
Great.
So keep on studying or start translating. Do you translate at all? Because you're equally qualified.
Yes, I translate, but with German to English, but yeah, not Georgian. I find your answer very interesting. I guess we probably don't have time now to go into more detail, but I don't yet fully understand. To me, it's very important to know the source language very very intimately in order to be able to translate it all. But I'm interested to learn more about your process. But I guess probably not enough time right now.
Yeah, it's not really. It's very complicated. I will say that the way one learns a native language is different than the way most people learn a second or third language. You learn a native language from within it, and you learn the second or third language from without it. And I think that's what, the translation of the poem has to come from within. So, and there is a mystery there. There is a gap. How is this possible? And sometimes I had a thing where, I would like with Orten, when we're translating and the native speaker would give me half a sentence and I had no idea, but I would, from my residence with the poet, I would go, oh, like a peach in my hand. And she'd say, yes, how did you know that? This is a very strange word for peach. And I felt that that's where he was going. It's a mystery.
All right, and the last question, Veronica.
Eileen, just first of all, let me say thank you once again for participating in this great conversation. It's very fascinating, all your life work and the process that you describe. It's very interesting. And I actually had more question about the process. How much of the context do you study before you translate, and how much of the history that goes into that, certain pieces you study before, and also the scholars that studied that particular poet before, how much of that do you read before you take on the translation?
Okay, so how much of what do I read? The previous translation?
The scholars that describe what the author was trying to say.
Okay, so I'll answer the last part first. Very little. I read very little of scholarship because scholarship is not poetic. It doesn't inspire me in general. And it turns on this analytic side of my brain, which I have turned on enough anyway in trying to solve. So I try to stay away from scholarship. We have a mutually hostile relationship in general. In terms of context, so when I did Rustaveli has so much context and it's so historical and so buried that Dodona, who was I mentioned, who helped me with this, she worked tirelessly to provide me with a lot of context, what was going on. But you see, the context of what? There was no specific context of Georgia. There was no specific context of Christianity or whatever. But she would find things in Rustaveli, like a reference to Mercury and his consort or whatever. And she would, I know about Mercury and the gods and so forth, but she would work to try to help me to figure that out, or about kings, how the way a court works, or the way, like, do we say slaves or do we say servants? Because in the ancient times, there were these figures that were something like a servant and something like a slave. They didn't have the rights of a servant, but people generally treated them better than the Greeks, for example, so I try to get context, and I depend upon native speakers, and that I will research a little bit, trying to get a sense of the macro world. But I've been lucky. When you think about it, poets, in my view, are notoriously unreliable when it comes to being a chronicler of current times. In fact, I read a fascinating article, I can't remember who wrote it, but the premise was that poets write more about what isn't than what is. They're what they want to have happen, what they fear will happen. So you're freer than a scholar would lead you to believe, I think. I have to think that way, otherwise I wouldn't translate.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Lyn, again for
Thank
joining
you.
us, to talk about Georgian poetry and share your experience of translating. We're certainly grateful that you're dedicating your time to this task, and hope that you continue to do so. I'm gonna seriously think about potentially doing some sessions on specifically on vepkhistyaosani, maybe kind of more like a book club type thing, and we'll see if we can.
That would be fantastic.
I think that would be interesting, especially not only for a lot of Georgians like me, and who came here when they were young, and like Nikoloz said, we read it in the 7th grade, and I didn't want to. I did not really like it as much as I like it now, but it would be great to revisit and discuss with others. So
you know what I'm thinking, Valerian? I'd like to start. We can do the scene with Asmat and Aftandil. I'll be Asmat, you be Aftandil.
Other than reenacting too. Not a great actor, so I don't know about that. I'll try my best. But thank you so much. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much. It was really wonderful, very inspiring. I really like, great audience. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lyn, and we'll be in touch. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Bye, Paul. Nice Vepkhistyaosani there in the background, I see. I don't think she's translated Shavela. That would be, that might be even more difficult than Rustaveli in some ways.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.